Good afternoon and welcome to the Spending Affordability Committee for Wednesday, November 12th. This afternoon, as part of the Spending Affordability Committee, we have the Senate and Budget and Taxation Committee, the House Appropriations Committee, and House Ways and Means Committee joining us. And also we have from the Maryland House Delegates, Speaker Adrian Jones, and also from the Maryland State Senate, Senate President Bill Ferguson joining us this afternoon. And if we may, we'll go through the presentations from the Department of Legislative Services for the fiscal briefing, and then go through all the presentations, and then we'll take questions at the end. And now I'd like to recognize my co-chair, Senator Rosapep, for opening remarks.
Welcome, everybody. I do want to give the Speaker and the Senate President a chance to make a remark or two if you'd like to. Senator Ferguson? No?
All set.
Okay. No, let's just get the show on the road.
Great. Thank you very much, Senator Rosapep. We'll start our fiscal briefing by the Department of Legislative Services with the overview by Mr. David Romans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to cover a variety of topics today, all of them related to the charge of the Spending Affordability Committee. The primary focus will be on the general fund and the revenues, economy, and general fund spending and the outlook for future years. But we'll also touch on transportation, personnel, and a couple other topics. I think for those of you who have not been following the budget closely in the last few months, the budget outlook is quite a bit worse than was forecasted at the end of session, and we will talk about that, why fiscal 27 is somewhere more challenging. And then kind of similar to what you saw during the session, the budget challenge more than doubles in magnitude in fiscal 28. So we'll also focus some on that challenge and what's driving that. With that, I'm going to
Mr. Romans, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just would say, for those of you who haven't been following the budget closely, the outlook is a lot worse for fiscal 27 than it was at the end of session. About $1.5 billion deficit versus a projected small surplus when we ended session. We will get into why that is. We will also cover a lot of topics related to the Spending Affordability Committee charge, particularly transportation, personnel, general fund outlook, and so forth. We're going to start it out, however, with focus on the economy and revenues with Teresa Chisinski of our staff.
Thank you. I assume there is a presentation that will be shared shortly. I'm going to talk about the economy and the revenues. We're going to start with the economy, and then we'll finish up with the general fund revenues. And we're going to start with the economy by this chart here on page 1, looking at what we know so far about calendar 2025. So the first 4 columns on this chart all deal with the labor market, beginning with the unemployment rate. So this is the unemployment rate by month. Because of the government shutdown, the last month for which we have data is the month of August. But you do see a somewhat of an increase in the unemployment rate. We started the year at 3%, and in August we were up to 3.6%. The next column is initial claims for unemployment insurance benefits. This is what's known as the regular state program. And what that means is it's the program that's used by the private sector, people who have lost their jobs in the private sector, or people who have been laid off by state or local governments. And these are the initial claims for benefits. You can see that we haven't really seen much of an increase here. Year to date through September, they're down slightly, 1.5% relative to 2024, indicating there had not been a significant number of private sector layoffs in the economy so far this year. Now, I will say, too late to include on this chart, we did get the month of October, and it did jump up 16.7%. That's about 1,900 additional initial claims for unemployment insurance benefits in October versus October of 2024. It brought the year-to-date up to 0.2% growth. That's likely related to the government shutdown. When the government shuts down, there are a lot of federal contractors who are also out of work and laid off, and those people would be applying for unemployment insurance in the regular state program. The next column is continuing claims for unemployment insurance. Again, in the regular state program, continuing claims are just what they sound like. It's somebody collecting UI benefits in 1 month and then the next month and so forth. But this has gone up a bit. It's up 11.4% year to date. If we factor in the month of October, it's about 12.8%. So this is an indication that although there has not been a significant increase in layoffs by the initial claims, people who have lost their jobs are maybe struggling a bit to find a new job and therefore are staying on UI benefits longer. And this is not unique to Maryland. You will see the exact same pattern if you look at the national data, where there hasn't been a huge increase in initial UI claims, but there has been an increase in continuing claims. The next column is also about unemployment insurance claims, but this time we're looking at the federal program. The federal program is appropriately called the Unemployment Compensation for Federal Employees. It works very similar to the regular state program, but it's for federal employees. It's funded by the federal government. And here we're showing you the level of UI claims rather than the percent change, because the percent changes are very large. This data is based on weekly numbers that I have summed for the months. And we did see a bit of an uptick early in 2025. This was probably the initial wave of federal government layoffs of probationary workers at the very beginning of the year. And then it kind of stabilized until you get to the month of October, and it does jump to over 4,000. Again, the government shut down. Federal employees who are furloughed and not required to report to work can file for UI benefits while the government is shut down. If an employee is required to show up for work, even though they're not getting paid, they cannot apply for UI benefits. When the shutdown ends, which will hopefully be today or the next day, when federal workers are paid for the time of the shutdown, as they are required to be paid by federal law, if they have received any UI benefits, they do have to repay those UI benefits going forward. And the last few columns here deal just with some other aspects of the Maryland economy, the vehicle sales market, as well as the residential real estate market. If we move on to the next slide, clearly we can move to the back one. There we go. The main story, of course, for the Maryland economy here in 2025 relates to the federal government. And what we're showing you on page 2 are a couple of bullet points to just sort of provide some background. If we were to go back to last year in 2024, Maryland had about 160,000 civilian federal jobs located in the state. This is a little bit of an undercount because classified agencies like the NSA are not included in these numbers. So it's actually a little bit more than that. It was only about 5.7% of employment. However, because federal jobs tend to be relatively high paying, it actually accounts for about 11% of wages in the state. Our neighbors, Virginia and the district last year were home to about 190,000 federal jobs. And because we know many Marylanders commute to those jurisdictions to work for the federal government, although some people do commute the other way. To get a handle on that total universe of the importance of federal jobs to the Maryland economy, the Comptroller's Office looked at tax year 2023 income tax returns and identified about 270,000 Maryland residents who had received a W-2 from the federal government, meaning they had at some point in the year gotten a wage from the federal government. That was about 9.5% of all taxpayers in 2023. Those federal wages accounted for about 9.2% of total adjusted gross income, although it was considerably higher in certain counties. The private sector benefits as well from federal government contract spending. In federal fiscal year 2024, that was about $42 billion, most of it coming from the Department of Defense and the Department of Health and Human Services. So that's where we stood last year in 2024. And the little chart at the bottom of this page shows you what's happened so far in this calendar year as it relates to federal employment. And again, because of the government shutdown, August is the last month for which we have data. So this little chart is just comparing the level of federal employment in August to what the level had been in January. And you can see Maryland has lost about 15,000 federal jobs. It's a decline of 9.3%, and we actually have the largest percentage decline of all the states. Our neighbors, Virginia and the district, have also lost a substantial number of federal jobs. So the whole region is down about 35,000 jobs, and the U.S. as a whole is down a little bit more than 100,000. A little bit less than 100,000. Keep in mind that for any federal employee who took that deferred resignation offer that was put out, I think probably back in February, those people stayed on the payroll through the month of November. So they are not part of this decline that you see here, although they will be going forward when we start to get more data for September and especially in October, because they would have stayed on the payroll through September. But if we want to broaden the lens to the entire labor market in Maryland, if we go to the next chart, we'll look at total employment, not just in the federal government, but across all sectors, public and private. And it's the same chart. It's comparing August employment to January employment. And although we have lost 15,000 federal jobs, we've gained almost that many state and local government jobs, so that the total government sector is down only slightly from January. I will point out that state government here includes the colleges and universities, the state colleges and universities. It does not come from the state budget. It's not going to line up with position counts in the state budget. It comes from the same source as all the other data on this chart, which is a survey conducted by the Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor. The local governments, according to this data, have also seen a substantial increase in employment. In the private sector, it's more of a mixed bag. We've seen job losses in manufacturing and transportation and warehousing, retail and wholesale trade. There's been a decline in professional and business services, which is where we would expect to find a fair number of federal contractors, although it's a very small decline of just 1,000 jobs. On the growth side, we've had pretty strong growth in the construction sector, as well as private educational services, so private colleges and universities, private K through 12 schools, as well as healthcare, which is a major sector in the Maryland economy, and leisure and hospitality services, which is things like restaurants and bars, along with hotels. The casinos are in this category. Other kinds of entertainment facilities are in this category. So in total, the private sector is up very slightly. You put it all together, and we basically have seen no job growth since January. Job growth, the level of jobs in Maryland in August was almost exactly the same as it was in January. I will say, when it comes to employment data, you have to be very careful. It is subject to revision. So what little we know about the first quarter suggests it's probably pretty good data at this point, but we have, in addition to not getting data past August, a lot of data has been delayed because of the government shutdown. So I just caution that this data can be subject to sometimes big revisions. If we want to move on to the forecast, and I'll point something out right here that just speaks to that. So this, when the BRE in September issued a new general fund revenue forecast, before they got to the revenues, they take a look at their economic outlook. And the chart here compares their new estimate in September to their previous economic outlook in March for the sort of top line variables: total employment, wage and salary income, total personal income, and in the lower right corner, capital gains income. And if you look at employment in the upper left corner and focus on 2024, this is a perfect example of what I just mentioned. Back in March, it looked like employment growth in Maryland in 2024 had been just 0.5%, and it was revised up substantially to almost 2% growth. There was also a substantial upward revision to wages from 5% growth to 6.5% growth. If we look at 2025, you'll notice that there's not much change between March and September in terms of employment and wage and salary income. The BRE anticipated it would be a weak year for the Maryland labor market, and so there wasn't much need to change their estimates. We had been talking here about employment in August versus January, but if you think about it on a year-over-year basis, because that's what this chart is showing you, percent change year over year, 25 versus 24. We look at employment in Maryland from January through August of 25 compared to January through August of 2024, it's actually up 0.4%. Wage and salary income is up about 3.6%. That number is a 6-month number because we have wage and salary income through the month of June. So those numbers, 0.4% growth of employment, 3.6% growth in wage income, that's very consistent with what the BRE had assumed in March, and that's why there's not much of a change in their September outlook. But 2026 is different. They're now anticipating a decline in employment in 2026 as the job cuts at the federal level really start to fully kick in. All those people who took the deferred resignation would come off. They also have lowered their estimate of wage and salary income to less than 3%. The last time we had wage and salary income growth below 3% was in 2013, if you exclude the oddities of the COVID years. The other thing I point out in terms of a big revision was in capital gains income in the lower right corner. I will point out here that the last year of actual that we have is for 2022. So 2023 and 2024 are estimates both in March and now. But the BRE revised up substantially their assumption about capital gains income in 2024. And this was really driven by looking at tax returns as they have come in for tax year 2024 in the spring, indicating large increases in final payments. That's usually an indication that there has been substantial growth in non-wage income like capital gains. But that meant they also plugged in a minus 15% in tax year 2025. We often see that in the history where when there's a big increase in one year, there's payback the next year. You'll notice that 2022 was down 49%. That comes after 2021, where capital gains income had been up almost 78%. So we want to move on now to the revenues on the next chart. And we're going to start with the fiscal 2025 closeout. So this table compares the actual in fiscal 2025 to the estimate, as well as comparing it to fiscal 2024. In total, general fund revenues exceeded the estimate by $521 million. That's a 2.1% difference. Growth was 3.4% over fiscal 2024. In total, it was 4.1% for ongoing revenues. Far and away, the biggest source of general fund revenues is the personal income tax. It exceeded the estimate by $264 million, a 1.8% difference. It grew 7% versus an estimate of 5%. In terms of withholding from people's paychecks, that was over the estimate and it grew 6.5%. But there was a slowdown in the second half of the year. Fiscal 2025 and the first half of the year, which would have been July through December of calendar 2024, withholding was up a very strong 8.9%. But in the second half of fiscal 25, which is January through June of 2025, withholding slowed substantially to 4.7%, which is still actually pretty healthy growth for withholding. And again, as I mentioned, in the context of capital gains income, we did see a big overattainment in final payments in fiscal 2025, and that too helped drive the overattainment in the personal income tax. The corporate income tax was below the estimate by $47 million. It fell 1.4%. That's a little bit, that is affected by the fact that the share of the corporate income tax going to the Transportation Trust Fund did increase between 24 and 25. Net receipts were down 0.4% versus an estimate of a 2.2% growth. The sales tax exceeded the estimate by $72 million. It grew 2.6%, which was twice as fast as expected. The sales tax likely benefited from people in the spring going out and buying durable goods ahead of tariffs in anticipation that there would be tariffs, which was a major plank of the Republican Party in last year's election. People went out and bought durable goods, things that are imported. A lot of that was related to cars, which does not affect the sales tax because we have a separate titling tax. But any kind of durable good that is either imported or has a lot of components that are imported spurred, if you look at the national data, an increase in durable goods spending in the spring. And the sales tax likely benefited from that. That would be a one-time effect. Those tariffs have gone into place, of course, and usually when one buys a durable good, you don't need to buy it again for quite some time. A couple other things to point out: the tobacco tax fell 8.7% from fiscal 24. There was a rate increase between these 2 years, but there was also a new distribution to the Blueprint Fund, which got $88 million from the tobacco tax in fiscal 2025. Among other revenue sources, a lot of the overattainment came from miscellaneous revenues and specifically from unclaimed property. That was $207 million, which is a very high number for unclaimed property when it's normally in the realm of $100 to $125 million. This is another case where this is something that's sort of a one-time effect, and we wouldn't really expect it to continue going forward. And the last page on the revenues will be the forecast. Unfortunately, there's a lot of footnotes here, so I apologize for how small the chart is. So this chart compares the September estimate for fiscal 26 to the March estimate. And then also we are showing you the BRE's new estimate for fiscal 2027. In total, the BRE wrote down as the revenues in fiscal 26 by $19 million. They're expecting growth of 3.7% in 2026 and 1.7% in fiscal 2027. To understand the revision, it's important to understand what's in each estimate. The March estimate has been adjusted for the law changes from the 2025 session. That's a source of a lot of the footnotes on this page. As you remember, the BRFA from 2025, as well as other legislation, made a variety of changes to the Maryland tax code. The March estimate has been adjusted to reflect all that. The September estimate, of course, also reflects all the changes from the 2025 session. What the March estimate does not reflect is the federal tax bill that was passed over the summer, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That was enacted in July. The September estimate does reflect the impact of that bill. What the March estimate does reflect is the previous large federal tax change, which was the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act had a lot of both personal and corporate income tax provisions. Most, if not all, of the personal income tax provisions were scheduled to sunset at the end of tax year 2025, the end of this calendar year. And the March estimate, like all previous BRE forecasts since that law was enacted, assumes that that sunset happens per the statute, because the BRE always does a current law forecast. However, when the fiscal 2026 budget was adopted, $40 million was added to the March estimate on the assumption that the federal tax bill that would be passed this year, because everybody knew there was going to be a federal tax bill this year, would extend the provisions of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And so that was added to the personal income tax estimate for March. The federal bill that was adopted this summer, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, did not simply extend the provisions of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. It made some changes to those provisions. It added a bunch of corporate provisions that were not anticipated, and we're outside of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, simply continuing that forward. In addition, and this is important, remember the 2017 bill was going to continue through tax year 25 and then sunset beginning in tax year 26. But the One Big Beautiful Bill Act made changes to the tax year 25 federal tax code. And so that has an effect on Maryland revenues as well. The BRE at the beginning of September released their analysis of the federal tax bill that was enacted this summer. They estimated that it would reduce general fund revenues by about $78 million in fiscal 2026 between the personal income tax and the corporate income tax. But if you add to that the $40 million that was added in March when the fiscal 26 budget was adopted, you get a loss of $118 million. And then the estimate in fiscal 27 is a negative $71 million. And those numbers are shown here for you for information purposes, but they are baked into the September estimates. They're already included in the estimates for the personal income tax and the corporate income tax, fiscal 26, the September column, and the fiscal 27 estimate column. A couple other things of note. Again, there were a couple of things I mentioned about 2025 that were something of a one-time nature, the unclaimed property, the very high unclaimed property. When the fact that the sales tax was helped along by people buying ahead of tariffs. And also, if you think about the revision to the economic outlook, both the expectation of a decline in employment as well as slow wage growth, that's going to feed in and affect the sales tax, which the BRE did write down by $35 million. We also, of course, saw that they put into tax year 25 an assumption that capital gains income would fall. The other things, a couple other things to note here, the tobacco tax falls substantially in tax year, in fiscal 2025, 26%. I mentioned that the blueprint got $88 million in fiscal 25. That's slated to go up substantially. In fiscal 26, the blueprint will get 32.6% of tobacco tax revenues. That's about $132 million. In fiscal 27, the blueprint gets 33.2% of revenues, or about $130 million. And one other thing to note here, you'll see almost an 11% drop in general fund lottery revenues in fiscal 2027. Some of this reflects an assumption that net revenues will fall slightly in fiscal 27. Outside of the occasional $1 billion Powerball or Mega Millions jackpot, the other games have not been growing very strongly. But more than that, there's a substantial increase in special fund distributions in the lottery, which are expected to go from about $150 million in fiscal 26 to almost $200 million in fiscal 2027. The full list of the special fund distributions in the lottery are shown in Appendix 1 on page 39. In fiscal 27, the estimate is for $475 million of general fund lottery revenues. We have not had that level of general fund lottery revenues since fiscal 2009. And that concludes the section on the economy and the revenues.
This section begins the look at the budget itself. This first page focuses on the deficiency appropriations that are anticipated for fiscal 2026. In total, DLS anticipates deficiency appropriations of about 1.37 billion, of which about 695 million are general funds. As you can see in this chart, about 49% of those relate to prior year costs. About 27%, or about $190 million, are related to the provider reimbursements in the Maryland Department of Health. The next largest component is the Department of Human Services. About 41 million of that is related to foster care, reflecting increased costs, particularly related to group homes, which had a substantial increase in rates in fiscal 2025, and increased spending for kind of non-placement related costs. There's also about $16.6 million assumed for costs related to the federal fiscal 2023 SNAP payment error rate penalty. We understand that there's a hearing in calendar 2026 appealing that. We also anticipate lower than expected vacancy savings than were assumed in the budget as enacted, which would be about $30 million. And then the child care scholarship is about $29 million. If you turn to the next slide, this looks at the same deficiencies, but in a slightly different way, showing the share of those deficiencies that are related to prior year costs as well as future year, or the current year costs, I should say. So the prior year costs are in blue and the fiscal 26 shortfalls are in yellow. As you can see, the Medicare, the provider reimbursements and MDH comprise quite a lot of the prior year costs, but the share of the overall shortfalls in among them vary. So for the Developmental Disabilities Administration, there's about 245 million in total deficiencies related to DDA. About 190 million of them are related to the prior year costs, compared to 55 million for fiscal 26, whereas the behavioral health of the 147 million, only about 40 million is related to prior year costs, where the remainder is for fiscal 2026. If you turn to the next slide, this begins the look at the fiscal 2027 growth compared to 26 after accounting for the deficiency appropriations. In total, DLS anticipates the fiscal 27 spending would increase by $1.4 billion. About 432 million of that is related to the reserve fund. About 450 million of that is related to the rainy day fund appropriation that is mandated as a result of the fiscal 2025 closeout. It also assumes $8.4 million for the catastrophic event account, which DLS assumes will be depleted due to the loan payments for the federal employees due to layoffs and shutdowns. The Medicaid and behavioral health related Medicaid expenditures, DLS projects increase by about $310 million. The majority of that is for Medicaid. There's also about 83 million for the behavioral health related Medicaid, and about 34 million related to the first year costs for the certified community behavioral health clinics. In local aid, that increases by about $187 million. About 79 million of that is because Blueprint revenue and fund balance is insufficient to support Blueprint costs in fiscal 2027. There's also about $77 million related to retirement costs for teachers, librarians, and community colleges. For the capital, that increases in total or on net by about $107 million. The growth there is driven by the WMATA capital grant. The last couple of years that has been funded through GO bonds. The CIP from the 2025 session assumes that this will be funded, or plans for this to be funded with general funds in fiscal 2027. If you turn to the next slide, This looks at the state agency spending growth of about $551 million. About $139 million is related to personnel assumptions. This includes about $94 million related to a 2% salary adjustment. About $50 million of that is related to health insurance contribution costs. About $98 million is related to major IT. That's based on what was planned to be spent in fiscal 2027 in the budget last year. There's about $73 million of growth for the More Jobs for Marylanders program. About $31 million, $32 million is related to a fund swap because fund balance was used to support the costs in fiscal 2026. In addition to that, there's about $61 million related to the provider reimbursements that are not Medicaid related for behavioral health, as well as the Developmental Disabilities Administration, and about $60 million related to the change in the administrative match rate for the SNAP program that was enacted as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and goes into effect in October of 2026. This growth is partially offset by decreases in a few areas, including one-time legislative additions, as well as one-time costs that were needed to be for the family program in the Department of Labor to cover costs with the delay in the contribution rates in the program from legislation that was enacted last year. The next section will be covered by Dave Romans.
Yeah, so here we kind of put together what Teresa's talked about with the revenues and what Tanya's talked about with the spending, and show you the outlook for fiscal 26 and 27. I would focus you in on that box there in the middle. It shows the cash balance and the structural balance. For fiscal 26, our forecast has you at a zero cash balance for that year. The reason for that is you did close fiscal 25 with a surplus, but you have all those deficiencies, $695 million in deficiencies that need to be paid for in 26. So that eats up the cash balance, and we actually assumed to take a couple $100 million out of the rainy day fund to cover the rest of those deficiencies, and that gets you to a zero cash balance in 26. In 27, you can see we're projecting about a $1.5 billion cash problem, about $1.2 billion structural challenge. Now, a key assumption we make for fiscal 27 is that the rainy day fund will maintain a balance equal to 8% of general fund revenues. So down near the bottom, second line from the bottom, that's almost $2.2 billion are in the rainy day fund in our forecast in fiscal 27. That's $815 million more than sort of the minimum goal the state has long had of having 5% of revenues in the rainy day fund. So there is quite a bit of cash there that could be potentially tapped. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so as I said at the outset, one of the big changes from what we showed you at the end of session is we went from a projected small surplus in fiscal 27 to a deficit of $1.5 billion on a cash basis. And we just want to give you a flavor of what happened and why that has changed so much. Nearly half of it relates to revenue assumptions. I'm going to skip to the second one there first because it's simpler to explain. As we talked about, the deficiencies were significant. We did not expect deficiencies in the forecast at the end of session. So you don't have the $321 million we were assuming back in June would be available from fiscal 26 to help pay for 27 bills. So having no cash balance is one of the issues on the revenue side. The bigger item, the $371 million, relates to the One Big Beautiful Bill and assumptions made during session. So as Teresa mentioned, the BRE assumed that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the Trump first term tax cuts, would sunset, which was what they were supposed to do under federal law. However, Governor Moore, in his budget forecast when he submitted the budget, assumed that they would be extended, kind of as is. And that assumption carried with it an assumption that there would be $300 million of general fund revenues in fiscal 27 and in subsequent years because of the continuation of the TCJA provisions. The reason for that 300 million is that the TCJA had capped state and local tax deductions at $10,000 that a person could deduct from their income taxes. So it was assumed that would continue, that like limits the amount of people can deduct and increases their taxable income, so they pay more Maryland taxes and more federal taxes. What actually happened, unfortunately, in the One Big Beautiful Bill is that they deviated from just extending the TCJA cuts. They raised the SALT cap from 10,000 to 40,000, meaning people could write off an additional $30,000 of state and local taxes, which obviously reduces their taxable income on both the state and local income taxes. So we don't get that 300 million bonus. We get a much smaller bonus from having some sort of cap on state and local taxes that can be deducted. The other thing that happened is that the One Big Beautiful Bill included a number of new business tax provisions that reduce state revenues. So bottom line is that while it was assumed at the end of session that we would get 300 million a year in general fund revenues from the One Big Beautiful Bill being passed, we actually end up with a negative impact of about 71 million in fiscal 27. So it's a 371 million swing. So that plus the deficiencies wipes out about 700 million of anticipated revenues that could have helped to pay for fiscal 27 costs. On the spending side, spending is about 800 million higher than we forecasted. And there's not one single item, there's a few big items there. The most interesting, perhaps, is the Medicaid behavioral health. We've seen over the last couple of years a fairly dramatic jump in utilization of behavioral health services by adults who are enrolled in Medicaid. Not so much for children, but adults, it's been a very heavy jump. I don't know that we have a complete answer as to why that is. And there was long thought to be sort of a underutilization of behavioral health services during COVID. And I think people kept waiting to see a surge in utilization as people went back to seeking those services. And perhaps that is part of what we're seeing here. I would also say that when you look at it in terms of utilization per Medicaid recipient, the Medicaid unwinding resulted in a lot of people being dropped off of the Medicaid rolls. We would speculate that some of the people who dropped off were probably the healthiest people who were able to, get jobs or improve their income, and thus were no longer eligible for Medicaid. So that the people left may be the folks who are, have more health challenges, both, regular health as well as behavioral health challenges. So that may also be driving that increase in demand from the remaining folks. K through 12 education costs are up because of teacher retirement and also a little bit less blueprint revenue, meaning that there's some general fund costs to implement the blueprint in fiscal 27. The One Big Beautiful Bill has about 100 million impact due to SNAP administrative costs being increased on states. The states will pay 75% of those costs going forward instead of 50%. And also we assume there's going to be some Medicaid administrative costs as we prepare for the Medicaid work requirements, which we've never had in Maryland before. And then you can see there's also higher than expected costs for employee health insurance, various entitlement programs, and the disparity grant formula is growing much more than expected. So that gives you sort of a flavor of what has happened and why things are looking so much more challenging for fiscal 27. Let's go to the next slide. So here we turn to the 5-year outlook, so fiscal 26 through fiscal 31. The blue bars show you the cash outlook. The reddish orange color shows you the structural. They're pretty similar in magnitude. As you can see in fiscal 27, as we already talked about a $1.5 billion cash shortfall. That more than doubles to about $3.2 billion in 28. And then it stabilizes some, growing to about $4 billion by the end of the forecast period. Let's go to the next slide. One contributor to that is the One Big Beautiful Bill, and this puts together the revenue and expenditure impacts. The green line shows you the net impact. And you can see in fiscal 27, about 171 net impact on our budget outlook, fiscal 28, about 121 million. So that's one contributor. We go to the next slide. This shows you sort of the drivers of cost from fiscal 27 to 31. So it's comparing what we're going to spend in fiscal 31 to what we're expecting to spend in fiscal 27. The blue bars are the dollars. So the top shows you all spending. It's expected to grow $7 billion. So in 2031, we'll spend $7 billion more than we project to spend in fiscal 27. That's about a 5.6% average annual growth rate. And then you can see the various components that drive that growth. By far, the biggest in the dollars, the blue bars, is the education aid, which general fund spending would grow nearly $4 billion, about 11% a year. But you also have growth of more than $1 billion in entitlements and more than 500 million in employee salaries and benefits. And you can see the other categories. To dig down a little more on the education aid, let's go to the next slide. So you've seen this slide the last few years. It shows how we're paying for the implementation of the Blueprint program. And it goes back to fiscal 25 and shows you out through 2031. And the different colors show you the sources of funding to pay for those implementation costs. So the dark blue is the ongoing Blueprint revenue. So we send a substantial amount of our casino revenues to the Blueprint Fund each year. The Blueprint Fund gets a small portion of the state sales tax revenues. It gets sports gaming revenues. And all those things bring in about $1.5 to $1.6 billion a year of new dollars to the Blueprint Fund. And there's a substantial portion of how we pay for implementing the Blueprint program. The green bars show spending of fund balance in the Blueprint Fund. So back a few years ago, when we were in very good fiscal times, the state socked away a lot of cash balance into the Blueprint Fund to help pay for the rollout of the program. And you can see that that money is being used in fiscal 25, 360 million was used. Fiscal 26, nearly $1 billion is budgeted from the Blueprint Fund. And for fiscal 27, our forecast assumes you use the remaining balance, $1.4 billion. The yellow shows you what general funds are needed to supplement the Blueprint Fund to fully fund the Blueprint implementation. There was no general fund need in 25 and 26. There's a fairly modest 79 million need in 27. But as that Blueprint Fund is exhausted, the fund balance is exhausted, you can see that our forecast has costs fall onto the general fund starting in fiscal 28 at over $2 billion. And so what the general fund's doing in 28 is funding both the swap from Blueprint fund balance to general funds and also most of the growth in Blueprint implementation costs from 27 to 28. And you continue to see the general fund contribution rise in subsequent years because the Blueprint implementation costs continue to grow all the way out through 2034. All right, let's go to the next slide. So I wanted to take a little closer look for you at fiscal 28, because as you saw, that's where you have this more than doubling of your structural and cash budget challenge. So what this chart shows is the expected growth from 27 to 28 in revenues over on the right-hand side. So revenues on the general fund side expected to grow about $1 billion, which is pretty healthy revenue growth. The spending is projected to grow from 27 to 28 by nearly $3 billion. And you can see the biggest components of that. What I really call your attention to is that purple part of the spending. That is that fund swap from Blueprint fund balance supporting the Blueprint implementation to the general fund backfilling that fund balance. That is nearly 1.4 billion or so. So just that fund swap is going to absorb all the general fund revenue, and you still need more dollars to help absorb it. That means that all the growth in costs, the actual increase in spending, the rollout of another year of Blueprint spending, growth in personnel costs, growth in Medicaid costs, and so forth, is above and beyond just that fund swap. So even if you froze spending on everything, all you tried to do is do the Blueprint fund swap, you don't have enough revenue to fully cover it. So it illustrates that there will be a need for pretty steep cuts across the budget in fiscal 28 and or some revenues in fiscal 28 to bring 28 into structural balance. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, then these last two slides I'm going to talk about try to get into, possible paths to at least getting through fiscal 27. And I'm going to talk a little about pros and cons here. So this chart in the 27 column shows, one option, the blue, is you could take the rainy day fund from 8% to 5%. And that would be 815 million toward your solution. However, there are a number of downsides to that I want to highlight. One is that does not provide any structural relief, so it doesn't do anything for solving fiscal 28. It also means you've spent that 800 million, so it's not there to help you in 28 with the problem. And it also isn't there if we go into an actual recession, which is certainly a risk with the various federal cuts that seem to be continuing. Lastly, I would say that the rating agencies that continue to rate us as AAA on our bonds have expressed concern, one, about our structural budget challenge in the out years, and two, they've noted that our rainy day fund balance, while pretty healthy at 8% for Maryland, is lower than typical for most of the other AAA rated states. So I think they would have concerns if we rate the rainy day fund balance, take it all the way down to 5%, and aren't making much progress on the structural challenge. Now, the other possible cash solution that we highlight here is that yellow sliver, about 119 million. That is in the fiscal stabilization fund. A portion of our fiscal 25 surplus was automatically by statute assigned to the fiscal stabilization fund, and it's supposed to be used in fiscal 27 for capital projects. It actually started at 191 million. The governor, using his emergency powers, has drawn 72 million out of that fund already to fund SNAP benefits and some help for food banks. But there's still 119 million there. It could be diverted from capital projects to the general fund to help solve the problem. If you were to use all that cash from the rainy day fund and the stabilization fund, your remaining challenge would only be 500 million. So there is a path using cash, but as I've said, there's significant downsides to doing that. The last thing I want to talk about is the next slide. Can we get, next slide, there we go. So this gets back to the one big beautiful bill and its tax provisions that relate to businesses. So there were three provisions that are highlighted in the bullets there on the right-hand side that Maryland automatically decoupled from for tax year 25 because they had an impact of more than $5 million on our revenues. For future years, Maryland recouples, if you will, with the federal government. So the federal changes would flow through to Maryland taxes starting in tax year 26. And that's a big part of our revenue losses. If Maryland were to decouple permanently from all three of those provisions, we would pick up 60 million of revenue in fiscal 26, and this is general fund revenue, and 192 million of general fund revenue in 27, and lesser amounts in subsequent years. So between that 26 and 27 column, decoupling would pick up 250 million towards your fiscal 27 challenge. So it's a potential option. The obvious downside is it won't provide the business relief that I'm sure the business community would like to see. But it is a possible option to help with your budget challenge. That's the end of kind of the big picture outlook. We're going to turn now to personnel issues and Jacob Cash.
Thank you, David. For the record, my name is Jacob Cash, a senior policy analyst at DLS. I'll be discussing state personnel. The first topic I'd like to discuss is the abolishment of nearly 500 regular budgeted positions in the executive branch. The Board of Public Works approved these abolishments in October as part of the state's budget balancing plan. Section 41 of the fiscal 2026 budget required DBM to identify 150 positions for abolishment and $11.5 million in related general fund savings. As you can see in this chart on page 20, DBM found 170 positions for abolishment. However, those only culminated to about $7.5 million in savings. So additional actions were necessary. The governor announced a voluntary separation program in July, or VSP, and that found additional positions to cut. The VSP offered active state employees a buyout of $20,000 plus $300 for each year of service as an incentive to separate from state employment. A total of 320 budgeted positions were approved for VSP by DBM and the hiring agency, and there were about 900 total applications. Employees were only approved if the hiring agency and DBM agreed that the position could be abolished with minimal impact to agency operations. The total cost savings for those abolished via the VSP is estimated to be about $2.5 million in the first year and $14 million in future years. And that's just because of the upfront costs of that payout. Overall, those collective position abolishments reduced the number of authorized positions in the executive branch by about 1% to 51,906, and it produced $10 million in savings. However, that still falls short of the budgeted amount in Section 41 of $11.5 million. This leads me to the next topic, so moving to the next page, which is turnover. This chart shows the authorized budgeted positions in the executive branch compared to the calculated turnover and vacancies that we were actually seeing. After accounting for all those personnel budget reductions that I just talked about, as well as additional funding cuts in the budget, the executive branch turnover rate must be at least 10.5% to meet the budget. And that correlates to 5,512 necessary vacancies using the statewide average salary. In October, DLS analysis showed that there was a total of 5,194 vacancies in state government, or about 10% turnover. So that is 318 less than what is necessary to meet the budget. There is an ongoing statewide hiring freeze, with exceptions for some departments and 24-hour facilities and those positions where it would be unsafe to have those positions be frozen. And that hiring freeze as a whole is presumed to continue until that actual vacancy rate reaches the budgeted turnover rate and they can meet the budget. However, at this point, it is unclear if separations and new hires or how those trends will play out, and if these actions will be sufficient to meet the fiscal 2026 budget. The third and final personnel topic I'll be discussing is filled positions. This chart on page 22 shows the number of employees on the state payroll for each quarter in the past year. During session this past year, the January vacancy rate was 10.2% for a total of 46,156 filled positions. Vacancies declined in April to 9.5%, and that was largely due to a reduction in separations compared to historical averages. As Teresa pointed out earlier, the economic instability and riskiness of the current economy is thought to be a factor in employees choosing to stay put since January. The vacancy rate stayed at 9.5% in July, but the number of filled positions on state payroll increased to over 47,000. And this put the state in a worse overall position regarding the budget than we had anticipated. Since July, the personnel actions previously discussed were taken, and so the executive branch has been able to reduce the number of employees on payroll to 46,712. That level is still higher than fiscal 2025, but it is on the way to the amount required by turnover expectancy in the budget. And that concludes my portion on the personnel.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Patrick Frank, and I will be discussing state debt policies. As we usually do in these briefings, we'll start with the affordability ratios. The state has two affordability ratios. The first is that debt service not exceed 8% of state revenues, and the second is that debt outstanding not exceed 4% of personal income. The exhibit on this page shows that debt service ranges from 5.9 to 5.5% of of state revenues, which is well below the 8%, and also the debt outstanding ratio is about 2.3 to 2.7%. Once again, it's as well below the affordability ratio, so the proposed capital program is affordable. The difference between the two is to do with what the issuance assumptions are, which essentially is how much and how quickly we think the capital projects will be moving. And to talk about that, we'll go to the next slide where I have an exhibit that shows what the authorization and issuance assumptions are. The green line that you see there, that is authorizations. Authorizations essentially is what we are committing to do. Capital projects usually take years to complete, so it is common for the bonds to be in what's called authorized but unissued. In other words, if we're not spending the money, we're not going to sell the bonds for that. There are federal law arbitrage reasons for that. And in all cases, the consensus is this is the CDAC's recommendation, and it's consistent with the CIP from last year, is that $1.75 billion will be authorized over the forecast period over the 6 years. The bars there are the different issuances assumptions, and what they have to do with is how quickly we think the work will get done. There was a problem in that we had some issuances that were slower than anticipated over the last couple of years, and this ratio of authorized and unissued to debt outstanding had risen a little bit higher. So the budget committees requested in the JCR that the State Treasurer's Office, the Department of Legislative Services, and DBM review issuances in order to see if changes in policies are appropriate. So the yellow bars that you see there, that is the established policy, which has been around well over 30 years. It's a fixed amount of issuance each year. It's constant, and it has the same rate now than it was 35 years ago. The second blue bar there is the work group and what their recommendations were. What the work group did is they took a look at what issuance have been over the last decade and concluded that the best approach is to have a weighted average, and that this be a moving average. And it be over 10 years. The reason 10 years was chosen is because it covers most of the business cycle. In most business cycles, we discussed 5 years, but determined or concluded that probably a little bit longer would, and a longer, to better cover the business cycle was more appropriate. The advantage of the moving average is that it's self-correcting in that if you always drop and add a year. So as issuances change, the assumptions would change. It granted is a lagging indicator, but it does tie itself to what's actually happening. And that's what the blue bars are, those issues and assumptions. So it is more modest than what was the established rate was. The red bar is what the CDAC, the Capital Debt Affordability Committee, ended up adopting. And that basically is, I was not part of the decision process, so I hesitate to say too much about it. But my understanding is the way it was adopted is they were looking at current spending and assuming that the current spending patterns that we have will continue, and that therefore that the amount of issuance is going to be quite a bit lower. I mean, it's unclear to me how this addresses recent increases in total authorizations, which, as many of you probably know, in 2025, there was a $500 million increase in total authorizations, and that was made fairly permanent. That's how we got to the $1.75 billion. Also, the recent backlog, it's unclear how that is going to get worked down. But anyway, so we have these three different kinds of approaches now that we could use, and on the next slide, I'll show the implications of them with respect to capital spending and how quickly the state spends its money on these projects and how quickly the projects are completed. The bars that you see there, with once again blue being the work group and red being the CDAC recommendation, shows how this authorized but unissued is going to change over the next 5 years. What you see is a fairly steady amount under the work group recommendations, but you see it increasing about $500 million a year under the CDAC assumptions. So They're both a little bit under $6 billion now. The work group recommendation stays pretty steady over that period, while the CDAC recommendation increases to over $8 billion of work that's been authorized, but hasn't been done. And it's kind of, if you will, a backlog in the capital program. As I mentioned earlier, what started this whole process is the lines that you see there, and that is that number of the ratio of the authorized but unissued compared to what was outstanding had increased to over 50%, which seemed a little high, so it seemed appropriate to consider what to do. Under the work group recommendation, there's the expectation that the state will be able to do the work that is authorized, and that number steadily declines to become more like the historical norms. On the other hand, the CDAC recommendation has that number continuously increase until the authorized but unissued is over, or about, I would say about 3/4 or 75% of the debt outstanding. On the next slide, it shows what the implications are for debt service. Not surprisingly, in the out years, if we're doing less work and less projects are being completed, we're spending less money and we have smaller debt service payments. So in the final year of the forecast, there's about $142 million less in spending under the CDAC proposal. DLS has looked at this, and we're going to recommend that the consensus forecast that was done, the consensus recommendation that was done by the work group, by the Treasurer's Office, DBM, and DLS be used. We think that the 10-year weighted average was the most appropriate way to estimate what issuances are going to be. It covers the business cycle. It allows for changes as the issuance changes. Also, we didn't really find a lot to suggest that the state would be unable to manage the increase in authorizations that happened a couple of years ago. So finally, we'll end with the recommendation is to use the work group issuance recommendations. And that concludes my remarks.
Good afternoon, Matthew Klein for the record. I'm going to discuss the non-transportation portion of the capital program. The slide on page 27, I think the takeaway here is that the commitments that have been made to the capital program exceed the level of resources that are currently at least set and available. Working from the left side of the exhibit, you can see the authorization level that has been established by the CDAC for the 2026 session, $1.75 billion. Much of that is committed to things that are ongoing. The capital program is supported with additional funds in the fiscal stabilization fund that David had mentioned earlier. It was $191 million, but is now $119 million based on the governor's actions to deal with the federal government shutdown on food assistance. Also, David had mentioned earlier, to the extent that these funds are used to help support the operating budget shortfall, they wouldn't be available to support the capital program. But those two sources now comprise the estimated source of funds that would support the capital program. Some of the pressures on the capital program, they're listed in yellow, and I think the end takeaway is that the combination of many of these components would leave the capital program about $84 million short relative to the resources that are available to the program. The first item is there was a shortfall in the bond premiums that were used to support the 2025 session capital bill by about $35 million. So to the extent that that is resolved using bonds, that would put additional pressure on the capital program. The legislature also included a number of pre-authorizations that were not built into the CIP. These are on Appendix 22 on page 71, if you'd like to take a look at those. But roughly $103 million of commitments above what's programmed. The IAC during the Capital Debt Affordability Committee briefings had indicated that the level of funding needed to fund school construction projects that are just ongoing, things that they've already made commitments to, that the level of funding programmed in the CIP is about $35 million short of reaching that level, which is roughly about $335 million just to hit the basic projects that are already underway, not to start anything new. Some slight increase in the escalation rates used to estimate capital projects in the CIP relative to the current rate that was used in estimating projects in the previous session CIP, as well as the CIP does not include an earmark for legislative bond initiatives. We've included 20 million here, but actual LBI funding spending has been roughly 62 million the last couple of years. So that leaves an estimated shortfall of about 84 million, depending on how some of these other components play out, particularly the funding, the 119 million in the fiscal stabilization account. Next slide. This shows the general fund and GEO component of the capital program. As had been discussed earlier, Patrick had mentioned that there was an increase in the authorization level, annual GEO bond authorization level from roughly about 1.2 to 1.75 billion to account for the fact that the state was going to be not be in a position to be able to use an extensive amount of general funds to support the capital program. However, the two takeaways from here, and I think this was mentioned earlier by Tanya, is that the CIP does include the return of funding for the WMATA grants to use general funds. The last couple of years, the WMATA grants have been funded with GEO bond funds. So this potentially could put additional pressure on the capital program to try to potentially shoehorn that commitment using bonds has been done the last couple of years. And also the bond program last year in particular was used to help support the operating budget to a tune of about $121 million by replacing programmed and already appropriated general funds with GEO bond funds. So that potentially, it would be difficult to do that in the 2026 session, given all these other pressures. Next slide. This covers University System of Maryland debt. I think the takeaway here is that the ratios that system uses, their debt outstanding to revenue, has improved significantly in the last few years from a high of about 3.2 relative to the benchmark that they use, which is 4%, all the way down to about 2% in the current year, with estimates climbing to maybe 2.3. We believe that there's some capacity for system to use some of its additional academic revenue debt to support the capital program, more commensurate with what was done in the past, when more of the ARBs were used to support capital expenditures that would otherwise be supported with GEO bond funds. So again, we think there's some capacity here for system to issue more academic revenue bonds, and that be a component to sort of helping resolve the issues with the shortfall in the capital program relative to the resources that are available. And that concludes my portion.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Samuel Quist. I'll be discussing the transportation portion of the briefing. This first chart here is showing an overview of the new Transportation Trust Fund revenues that were enacted during the 2024 and 2025 legislative sessions. So on this chart, we have the actual revenue attainment from the first set of new revenues that were enacted in 2024, and then the projections for the 6-year forecast period from 2026 through 2031. So this chart is showing that the actual revenue attainment from the new revenues in fiscal 2025 was 195 million, which was roughly similar to what the projections for those were. There was some lower attainment in the vehicle registration fees, but this was offset by some higher than projected attainment in the transportation network company fee. During the forecast period, these revenues are projected to attain about $4.8 billion in new revenues for the Transportation Trust Fund. This averages out roughly to about $800 million annually during the forecast period. If we turn to the next slide, this next slide shows a comparison of the two most recent financial forecasts issued by the Maryland Department of Transportation in September and then last January, and then a comparison to the DLS Transportation Trust Fund forecast in November to the September forecast. So starting with the revenue section, you can see that the September MDOT forecast is reflecting about $1.2 billion in higher revenues compared to the January forecast. 480 million of this is due to new uh, projected bond proceeds in the out years of that forecast, as well as $670 million in the new revenues. The January 2025 MDOT forecast did include some of the new revenues that we talked about on the previous slide as contingent on those enactment during the 2025 session. So some of that was already accounted for in the prior year forecast. And then the DLS November forecast is estimating an additional about $533 million in revenue. On top of that, 460 million of that additional revenues is from projected additional bond capacity, which I'll talk more about in a moment, and then $73 million in higher tax and fee revenue and fund balance. Within that $73 million figure, about 46 million of that is attributable to the actual closeout balance of the TTF at the closeout of fiscal 2025. The closeout was a little bit higher than what the September forecast showed due to the timing of the issuance of that forecast prior to when the closeout was completed. And then the other $27 million higher figure making up the other portion of that 73 million was tax and fee revenues. DLS forecast a couple of things related to the motor fuel and the titling tax revenues. DLS is projecting overall a slightly lower attainment from motor fuel taxes, but a slightly higher attainment from titling taxes in the out years. So that results in a slight net increase in tax attainment over the MDOT forecast. Then as far as the DLS forecast of debt capacity and bond proceeds, due to the projected overattainment in tax and fee revenues, as well as the projected debt service coverage ratios in the out years in the MDOT September forecast remaining above their target debt service coverage ratio of 2.5 net income to debt service coverage. DLS is projecting that they could issue about $460 million in additional bonds above what they've already projected in fiscal 27 to 2031 and still remain above that 2.5 debt service coverage ratio in each year through 2031. As far as expenditures, reflecting that additional bond capacity that DLS is projecting, the debt service increase would be about $75 million in total above the debt service totals that MDOT has in their September forecast. The $75 million increase is also taking into account that MDOT had a bond sale in October. Part of that was refunding of previously issued debt, which resulted in some savings projected in future years for bond debt service for prior year debt. Operating expenses, the MDOT September forecast projects about a little over a $900 million increase in operating expense growth. The DLS forecast is slightly higher than that, about $30 million higher than that. MDOT has had some large year-over-year increases in operating expense growth the last couple of years. This is due to a variety of factors, including personnel expense growth. There's been additional positions in MDOT added for focusing on delivery of transit services. Contract escalation, there's been some large increase in contract escalation that's related to some of the provision of transit services. And then there's some future operating expense growth in the out years projected once the purple line becomes operational. So that over $900 million increase that's projected in the out years, that will account for a large portion of those new transportation trust fund revenues. And then for capital, accounting for the DLS forecast, accounting for the higher debt service and slightly higher operating budget, and accounting for the increased revenues, that results in about $428 million in additional state funds for the capital program. And then at the bottom of this chart, which is looking specifically at the capital program, you can see that reflected there. The September 2025 draft consolidated transportation program that MDOT issued grows by about $268 million in total capital spending compared to the final January 2025 CTP, and then the additional projected 428 million that DLS has. The breakdown there, about $19 million would be increased for highway user revenue capital grants based on the higher tax and fee revenue that mandated funding is based off of. And then there would be an additional $409 million for the MDOT statewide capital program. We can turn to the next slide. Yes, this slide, we have two bar graphs here, which are showing some additional detail on the MDOT capital program. So this is comparing the September draft 2026 CTP to the final January 2025 CTP. The top chart is breaking down the capital spending plan by MDOT mode. You can see here that the State Highway Administration is the largest portion of the capital program at about over a third of the capital program. And the State Highway Administration also has the largest increase in the 2026 draft CTP at about a $735 million increase in funding. And this is due to some projected increase in spending on bridge and road maintenance projects that they have programmed in the out years. Then for the other modes, the next largest, the Maryland Transit Administration, is about a quarter of the capital program. And in the Maryland Transit Administration, the Maryland Port Administration, and the Maryland Aviation Administration, these three capital programs are all projected to decrease in the 2026 draft CTP. This is largely due to the completion of some larger capital projects that result in some wind down of spending in the future years. So that's why there is a decrease in MTA. The purple line is projected to wrap up in construction in a couple of years from now. The Maryland Port Administration, the Howard Street Tunnel project is also projected to wrap up in the near term. And then the Maryland Aviation Administration, there's been some larger projects at BWI Airport that are projected to wrap up as well. So that's why there's some decreases in those areas. And then the chart at the bottom of this page is showing a breakdown of the capital program by spending category. So you can see that spending for system preservation is the largest share of the capital program at about 38% of total capital spending. And in the draft 2026 CTP, funding for system preservation grows by about $316 million. We can move to the next slide. This slide, the graph here is showing some additional data on spending for system preservation in the capital program. The black line on this chart is showing the 10-year average of system preservation funding levels for the 10-year period ending in fiscal 2025. The 10-year average of funding was about 1.1 billion. And then the bars on this chart are showing the amounts, annual amounts each year that were programmed for system preservation. And then the line is showing that percentage of the total capital funding. So in fiscal 2025, the amount was about 1.25 billion, a little higher than the 10-year average. 26 is right at the 10-year average, about 1.1 billion. And then fiscal 27 is projected to increase above the 10-year average to about 1.4 billion. Then the last thing for transportation at the bottom of this page, this just notes that one of the requirements of the Spending Affordability Committee is to make recommendations on the fund balance for the Transportation Trust Fund and a recommended minimum expenditure level for system preservation by MDOT. So for some context, the MDOT financial forecast has about a $500 million targeted fund balance for fiscal 26 through 28, and then a $550 million targeted fund balance for 29 through 31. And then the 10-year average funding level for system preservation, as I mentioned previously, was about 1.1 billion. That will conclude the transportation portion of the presentation.
This last slide looks at disaster-related funding. There has been some discussion about changes to the federal government role and the availability of assistance from FEMA to cover disaster-related assistance. The state has two funds that can be used to cover costs related to natural disasters. The catastrophic event account, which also includes funding that can be used to support federal employee financial hardship. And the other is the State Disaster Recovery Fund, which was established in Chapter 549 of 2023, which provides disaster relief when whether or not there is an official disaster declaration made. As I mentioned previously, DLS has assumed that the full amount of the catastrophic event account is used for the related to the federal government shutdown and layoffs, and that it would be replenished in fiscal 2027 to $10 million. DLS also anticipates the State Disaster Recovery Fund would have about a $2.3 million balance at the end of fiscal 2027. The chart at the top of the page shows the amount of disaster recovery that we've received by year since 2010. Disaster dollars are generally received over multiple years, so this reflects what was received in each year and not the amount of total disaster funding for disasters that occurred in those years. As you can see in this chart, the amount that has been received has varied quite substantially, and there was no revenue, no funds received in 2024, 2025. The state had requested assistance of about $34 million for Western Maryland, which has been denied. The average has been about $21.4 million across 2010 through 2025. The state should consider maintaining a combined balance in these two funds of at least $21 million to cover disaster costs in future years. And with that, I'll turn it back to Dave Romans.
Yeah, just to wrap things up, I think, as you saw, both in the operating and the capital budget, there are significant challenges this year. I would put a plea out there that as you work on thinking about your strategy for balancing fiscal 27, that you try to make some headway toward fiscal 28, as that fiscal 28 operating challenge is rather daunting. With that, we have completed our presentation. We are happy to answer any questions the members have.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Romans, and the entire Department of Legislative Services for the extensive presentation. We have questions from some of the members. We have Delegate Buckle.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had two kind of questions just to clarify some things. I really do appreciate DLS's efforts. This is obviously a tremendous amount of information that's been compiled and to take in this limited period of time. But and I don't know, Mr. Romans, if I think some of the questions I have relate to some specific slides or pages from the presentation. Maybe Ms. Kaczynski went over those. I'm not positive. But I'm turning to page 3 of the presentation that you did, the discussing employment. Am I interpreting this correct? Is it fair to say that we lost around 15,000, at least through the period of time that we can accurately calculate? It's not up to date till yesterday, obviously. But during the period of time encompassed by this analysis, we lost about 15,000 federal employee jobs, but it looks like we gained almost 14,000 state and local government new positions. Is that a fair analysis?
That is correct. I mean, that's the data as reported. As I mentioned earlier, there's the big caveat is this data is subject to revision, but that is the data as currently reported in this payroll employment series.
Okay.
So that on net, the government sector combined, federal, state, local, is down slightly since January.
Right. I mean, that's what I took from it is that almost, not 100%, but almost, and it's certainly not one for one. Someone leaves working for the federal government and automatically works for the state.
No.
But in the aggregate, total number of government workers per se in Maryland is down about 1,000 people over this period. It's not down, 15,000 because we have hired quite a few people in state and local government. The second question that I had was to get some clarification. Bear with me. I have a really hard time calling something a one big beautiful bill act. I think that's the dumb name. It sounds silly. It's not anybody's fault. That's a name somebody else gave it. I'm not going to call it that. But I'm taking a look at page 12 and page 14 of the presentation. And am I understanding this correctly? When we talk about revenues are lower, that's on page 12. Revenues are lower because of the impact of this federal legislative enactment. And I believe, Mr. Romans, you said $371 million. When I look at page 14, it doesn't look like that. It looks like the revenue is down $71 million. Is that because our forecast of what the revenue estimates were going to be was off $300 million to the good, or is that because we've actually lost revenue from last year because of the enactment of the legislation, if you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. So the page 14 is showing the actual revenue impact versus what the Board of Revenue estimates assumed during session. They assumed that the Trump tax cuts, if you will, from the first term they would all sunset, they would all go away. And so versus that scoring, they show some modest revenue losses. The larger number that I showed in the other on slide 12, the 371 million, is that both the Moore administration and DLS during session were assuming that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act would be extended, that it would not sunset, and that if they extended it as it was in the Trump's first term, that we would have picked up $300 million, which the BRE agreed with. But the actual One Big Beautiful Bill deviated substantially from the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, both by having a number of business tax relief provisions that cost us revenue, and by increasing that SALT cap from 10,000 to 40,000, which lets people deduct more income. So that's right. It depends on what you're comparing to. Compared to what the BRE had assumed during session, it's a relatively modest impact. Compared to what the Moore administration and DLS was assuming, it's a much bigger impact.
Okay, so compared to BRE, really it's about $70 million, but compared to what other people estimated, it's not actual money out of our pockets from last year. It's not our revenues went down. I thought I saw something in there that showed that our revenues actually went up, page 5, 2.1%. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
I don't want to make a mistake. So our revenues are actually up, but we're still spending more money to exceed what our revenue growth is. Is that fair?
Yes, I mean, our structural problem is because our revenues continue to grow faster than our ongoing revenue.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity.
Delegate Pippy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to second the appreciation for DLS compiling this very comprehensive presentation. So Mr. Romans, maybe you could direct this question to where you feel most important. We heard a little bit about State Highway, the Transportation Trust Fund. So my question is, we became aware of some recent audits, particularly related to the State Highway and some potential funds that were requested from the federal government. I think it was 446 million. So my question is, if that money does not come from the federal government, if in fact our federal partners say that we're not paying it, it was requested, I don't know, fraudulently, whatever word you want to use, how will that impact our fiscal outlook as it pertains, one, to that fund, and then two, generally? So is that incorporated into the fiscal outlook that was presented today?
That is not incorporated. The draft CTP doesn't make any explicit assumptions about that audit finding, and we didn't make any explicit assumptions. I would say two things. I mean, a lot of it gets into a cash flow question. As we understand it from our conversations with MDOT, if they can't charge some of those costs to federal funds that they've tried to charge to federal funds, they would still have that federal funding available, in future years to pay for other projects potentially. So there may have to be some, using state funds to close that audit gap, and then perhaps they'll be able to use more federal funds in future years that saves some state dollars in those future years. The other thing I would say is that MDOT always assumes a large cash balance at the end of each fiscal year. I think the draft CTP assumes 500 million of cash balance. So if we aren't able to claim any of that 400 plus million that the audit identified, it would definitely, worst case, if it all has to be borne by the Transportation Trust Fund, it would basically eliminate most of the cash balance. They do have that balance there that will help mitigate in the near term the impact of if they're unable to claim a lot of those federal funds. So it's certainly a significant concern. It could significantly impact the state cash resources MDOT has available, but that fund balance should help mitigate that to some extent.
So just real quickly, just so reading between the lines, if the state has to substitute its cash funds to cover that delta, that would certainly increase the deficit that we're projecting, would it not, assuming that those facts play out?
Well, the big deficit that we're talking about is on the general fund side, and so it shouldn't have any direct impact on the general fund. It would leave MDOT with a lot less cash balance. It might make it a little more challenging for them to issue as much debt as they're hoping to. So it may ultimately force some constraint in the transportation program going forward. But because of the large cash balances, I don't think it would have an immediate negative impact.
Okay. Thank you.
Chair Rosapat.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. I want to go back to the estimates on the reduction in federal employment and increases in state and local employment. I think we were told that well, let me just say, what is the source of that data? I was a little unclear about that.
So this is what comes from what's known as the Current Establishment Survey, which is a survey of businesses that the U.S. Department of Labor does every single month. So it doesn't come from state budgets. It doesn't come from local budgets. It's not going to line up to the numbers that you may have in your head about the state budget. And they do a survey of private sector businesses. They do a survey of government agencies. And that is how that's how the numbers are put together. It does include those. It's important to keep in mind. It does include every state, employee at, including student employees or contractual employees at the colleges and universities. So it doesn't matter if you're part-time, doesn't matter if you're contractual. As long as you're on the payroll, you're counted as a job in that data as it's constructed by the Department of Labor.
And when you say Department of Labor, do you mean the Bureau of Labor Statistics or a different
agency? Right, exactly. The Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Well, I thought that among his attacks on many federal agencies, that Trump had gone after the Bureau of Labor Statistics to behead the agency, to tell them to change their numbers in a way that he wanted. So it raises a question in my mind as to whether we have any credibility with those numbers as opposed to the actual numbers we have for state employment.
Well, I mean, it is true that the Trump administration removed the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I believe, in late August. There is now an acting head. Obviously, during the shutdown, nothing has been happening, but prior to the shutdown, an acting head was a career BLS person was put in charge of the agency. Um, just listening to the economists, we contract for example, the people at Moody's, they still feel comfortable with the data that's come out. Now we haven't gotten a lot of data since that happened because we've only really gotten, the month of August. But that was largely done at the time that person was relieved of their position as the head of the BLS. So, and no new, I think the original person who was nominated with that nomination was pulled. And then, of course, with the shutdown, they have not, I'm not even sure a new person has been nominated to head the BLS. But there's a lot of concern. It's understandable to take that person out of that job, someone who had a lot of experience. But so far, given the data we had, I don't get the sense from listening to like the economists at Moody's that they're that concerned. Now, that doesn't mean the data can't be revised. And as I pointed out, there was a substantial revision in 2024. So it may not be what comes out when they finally not only get through going back to releasing data normally on a monthly basis, but there's a whole series of annual revisions that go on for a while.
Thank you. That's helpful. But also the point you make is that the data set is different for that study for our actual data set for state employees. And so
exactly.
The question is how much we should rely on that. Thank you very much.
Delegate Griffith.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the briefing. I know a lot of work goes into this. My question is kind of around like the blueprint and the projections and all that. So I know the model for blueprint was built on pre-COVID era models. So how much higher has the actual teacher salaries, construction costs, and programmatic cost and expenses compared to what the original formulas were? How much of that adjusted since pre-COVID versus now?
Well, so most of a lot of the funding commitments made in the blueprint legislation were very specific in terms of the, aid per student in the foundation each year. So those things don't really automatically change. The amounts were set in statute. There were some small tweaks made last session to the blueprint program by the General Assembly. But for the most part, I would say, and I don't think it's been dramatically changed. The thing that changes the cost are enrollment changes, that happen each year. COVID had an impact on enrollment, so that sort of changed the outlook. There's different estimates today about the demand for special education services and so forth. So those sort of assumptions have changed some, but I wouldn't say the underlying cost estimates on a kind of per student basis have changed a whole lot.
But what about for like teacher salaries and some of the ancillary costs of Kerwin? Pensions, things of that nature.
We can look at what teacher salaries have done versus what was forecast. Kerwin was developed partly to increase teacher salaries, and that's part of why there's substantial funding. So I think teacher salaries have gone up quite a bit, but that was partly the intent of the Kerwin program. But we can pull some data for you on kind of what was assumed and how salaries now compare.
Thank you.
Delegate Christ.
Chairman, thank you, David, and your team. We're looking forward to seeing you guys in a couple of months. So if we're looking at first couple of pages, it said that it was showing the number of federal employees in each of DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And it looks like Virginia has about 40,000 more federal employees than Maryland. So arguably, we can say based on that, they may be more dependent on the federal government than we are. And 2 weeks ago, they came out with a report, the 2025 Virginia Statewide Economic Analysis Report, and it shows that the Commonwealth's labor market is outpacing national trends. They're also experiencing steady job growth, low unemployment, rising wages. It also states that the private sector wage growth is outpacing inflation. Virginia Commonwealth is the sixth fastest growing economy in the country. And in regards to their state budget, they have a $211 million, well, their revenues are $211 million more than what their forecasts are. So that picture is the complete opposite from what we're hearing today. So what's the difference? I mean, what are they doing that we're not? And how is Virginia, which is arguably more dependent on the federal government than we are, they're killing it when it comes to economic growth, and also overcoming, what the federal government's doing, because the federal government's doing exactly, the same things to Virginia that's happening to Maryland. And how are they able to overcome that? And it seemingly we're struggling.
On the broader question, I think we'll have to take a look at, all the statistics and compare Maryland and Virginia and get back to you. I would say on the revenues, a couple of things. One, Maryland did actually close fiscal 25 with revenue, 500 million to the good. So I think, kind of backwards looking, we actually did have strong revenue performance. So I'm not sure quite what time periods have been compared, but I think, both states closed, I suspect 25 pretty strong. I think, it's always difficult to compare one state to another on their revenue estimates because every state has different approaches to revenue estimating. I think part of why Maryland did well in 2025 is because the BRE was quite conservative, both in December and March, in trying to, say, hey, we know that, federal cuts are coming, that, we're going to build some of that into our forecast even as early as fiscal 25. I don't know how Virginia responded, but it always, some of it gets back to how conservative the revenue forecasting is. But I think the broader question you raise is a good one, and we will, do some analysis to try to understand better what's going on in the two states.
Yeah, I mean, because they already did, as far as I know, David. I mean, you can confirm this or not. I think they were able to actually do one round already of tax cuts actually for their residents, and I think they were actually preparing to do a second round prior to last Tuesday's election. So clearly, they're in a very good financial position. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to do that. So, thank you.
I'll just jump in and just keep in mind that Virginia is a much bigger state than Maryland. So even though their total federal employment is considerably larger, so is their total employment. So federal employment in Maryland, the number of jobs, I think I mentioned, was about 5.7% of total jobs. In Virginia, it's about 4.6% of total jobs because they have about 4 million jobs in the state versus Maryland has, I think, a little over 2 million. So they are a much bigger state. It's a little hard to compare just directly to them. I guess we have about 2.8 million jobs in the state. So just keep that in mind.
The Appropriations Committee Chair, Chair Barnes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just, David, want to get back to a little bit on a couple things actually that you were actually making the point on as well. First, Delegate Buckles' points on estimates versus projections, and this estimate versus that projection. To be clear, David, these are all estimates and projections, correct?
Yes, everything looking forward at 26, 27 is all estimates.
And when we left session, we made estimates and projections, but we couldn't have done an estimate or projection, for example, in the big, beautiful bill on the corporate tax cut that we saw in that bill. We couldn't have estimated or projected that because it didn't exist. And now we've baked that in, right? Because it flows through to Maryland. So these corporate tax cuts are impacting now our state budget. That's a real-time thing that we could not have estimated or projected when we left session.
Correct.
But we did estimate about $1 billion so far in lost revenue from negative impacts from the Trump administration, which is what you were saying in our conservative sort of BRE budgeting. We have made that 500 million last December, 450, I think, last March. Now we have this big, beautiful bill all amounting to over $1 billion in projected lost revenue, all projected.
Yeah, when you take into account the assumption we were going to get 300 million a year from the one big beautiful bill, yeah, we've seen a substantial loss of expected revenue from federal dollars, from the federal changes.
And I think you alluded to it. The only real hard number we have that's not an estimate or projection, what we do know, we have now closed out, the only fiscal year we've closed out is fiscal 25. And we closed that out with a $500 million surplus. Is that right?
Yeah, we outperformed our expectations by 520 million.
And I would say that, and I will just commentary here, I will say that is largely based on really conservative budgeting and good work from the House, the Senate, and the governor. That's what we know, though. Those are the hard fact data. That's what we know, is that we did close out fiscal 25. But we also know that we have had huge, tremendous negative impacts from the actions of the Trump administration, and unfortunately, probably likely to see more, not just in Maryland, but nationally, with impacts from tariffs, with federal job force, and the like. So I just wanted to make those points clear, and I appreciate you, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And are there any other questions from members of the Spending Affordability Committee?
Yes.
Chair Rosepap.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make a final comment, sort of along the lines of what Chairman Barnes was saying, but from a slightly different angle. Looking at this big picture, when we came into session earlier this year, we thought there were risks that were going to come about because of what President Trump and Elon Musk were intending to do. As the session went on, we saw it in real life. We saw them destroy USAID. We saw them attack the Social Security Administration. And it goes on and on and on. But because of the way they were doging employees, the impact of the federal layoffs, firings, whatever you want to call them, haven't played out as quickly as we might have feared. And partly people were paid through the end of September, and then they closed down the government at the beginning of October. And so we don't have data on that. And this leading to a question for David, big picture. It looks to me as though we've seen some of the dangerous effects of the Trump administration, including the corporate tax cuts, the tax cuts for wealthy people, the raising costs of administering social welfare programs like SNAP. But we're less than a year into the administration, and the effects of things they've already done don't seem to have flowed through yet to the data that we have, which leads me to believe that the worst is yet to come. Is that a fair way of looking big picture at the data we're seeing in terms of the effects of all the federal activities on the Maryland's fiscal situation?
I mean, I think on the revenue side, you're right that we haven't seen as big an impact from the job cuts because so many of the people were paid through September, and right now it's hard to sort out what's going on because of the shutdown. So I think we do expect to see a bigger impact from those job cuts as we go forward. The BRE has certainly done its best to try to build that in to its revenue forecast, but it remains to be seen whether the adjustments they made are sufficient as we see in real time how this plays out. Is do those federal workers find work, or are they remaining unemployed? So I think there is a risk on the revenue side. I think on the spending side, so far we've built in pretty well what we think the impacts of the one big beautiful bill will be on SNAP and Medicaid. But of course, it's you never know what's going to come next, what actions Congress might take. There's been some talk at the congressional level about another reconciliation bill, so there could certainly be future rounds of cuts that are not built in and will make our situation even more challenging.
And if I may just add, I appreciate that, David, very much. I just add that the deal that they haven't agreeing to today is a deal till the end of January. So Trump could shut down the government again 3 months from now, right at the beginning of our session. That seems to me like a big downside risk for Maryland's economy. Let me just leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairman Rosepap. And thank you again to the Department of Legislative Services for the presentation and to all the members for the questions. And just want to remind everyone that the next meeting for the Spending Affordability Committee will be on December 17th at 2 p.m. And that concludes today's Spending Affordability Committee.